Test, test. Yes, sir. Test, test. Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Dr. Hugh Ross's Paradoxes Sunday School class. Today is March 19th, 2023. Uh, Dr. Ross isn't with us today. He's out on one of his forays. And we have Dr. Mark Clark with us today. Let me read a little bit about him. One second. He's a PhD and Professor Emeritus of Political Science, Director of the National Security Studies at Cal State San Bernardino. He's published on nuclear strategy, theories on war, the field of intelligent analysis, and other topics on national security. He also co-authored a book with Hugh Ross and Ken Samples, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. And if you haven't seen it, here it is. It's been out for a couple decades, but it's still very pertinent. Despite being a couple decades old, it's very much useful today. And you'll learn about RUFOs, what they called residual UFOs, the small percentage that are actually hard to explain. You can't write them off. So RTB has this. There's also a video that goes with it. Very good video. Let's see. And Dr. Clark will be talking on engineering and politics while maintaining our witness for Christ. And he'll be back again on the 23rd of April. So be prepared for that. Dr. Ross will be back for the next 3 weeks. And Dr. Cavolo, who started presenting to us, let me get it straight here. Abraham Kuyper, a renowned theologian from the past. He's got 3 more sessions on that. And the dates of those are consecutive. Sunday, the 30th of April, Sunday, the 7th of May, and the 14th of May to finish up. So it's a 4-part thing. So try to be present for those. And we have treats today right back here. Help yourself. And with that, let me say a little opening prayer. Lord God, we thank you for this moment and for Dr. Clark, the substitute for Dr. Ross today. Bless his message, Lord. Open our minds and hearts that we can understand all that's coming our way and use it as a witnessing tool for you. We ask it in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Dr. Clark, Semper Fidelis, mi amigo, for former Marines. Come on up.
Thank you, Mark. We have several Marks in this class, so it's when people holler Mark, we don't know who's talking to whom. So with apologies here, let me start this, and we shall get going. Do the slideshow. Good. So the topic is engaging politics while maintaining our witness. It's a talk I've done at our church back home. It's a talk I've done to the scholar community for Reasons to Believe. And I think it's a useful topic for a variety of reasons because, as you know, politics gets in the way of everything sometimes. And really, I think the title probably should better be said as how do we engage in politics? How do we witness while managing our politics? But I'm going to start with a couple of ideas here, and I want us to follow through. In 2002, so 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, a group of Americans were on a Christian heritage tour of China, and they were introduced to a senior analyst with the Chinese Academy of the Social Sciences in Beijing. And this Chinese social scientist, who was a good communist, to get anywhere in China, you have to be a good communist, said this. He shocked the audience. And again, they were on a Christian heritage tour of China. He said this: one of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminence of the West all over the world. We studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next, we focused on your economic system. But in the last 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. This is why the West has been so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. This analyst concludes with, we don't have any doubt about this. And if you're interested, there is a really good book on this topic. It's called Jesus in Beijing by David Aikman, former New York Times and other journals from elsewhere. Today, of course, by contrast, we see the division of politics in the United States. Politics has not only divided us, but it has infected almost every conversation. Many families have divided over having different political views. We all know it, we've all seen it. The rise in power of a very strong, what I call illiberal movement. The idea of illiberalism is opposed to liberalism. It's be quiet, don't talk, control what you say. We see this illiberal movement today in the United States, but we see it in many countries of the world. And one of the things that I want to address is not just the United States, Christianity and politics, but whether you're a Christian here in the United States, in the West, or anywhere in the world, how do we think about politics while doing this? Francis Wilkinson wrote a piece for Bloomberg in 2021 that said, the title's piece was, America's churches are now polarized too. Quote, I've been studying religion and religious congregations for 30 years, said Michael O. Emerson, sociologist at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and an author of numerous books on American religion. He said, quote, this is a level of conflict that I have never seen. What is different now? The conflict is over entire worldviews, politics, race, how we are to be in the world, and even what religion and faith are for. The biggest challenge for us and for our fellow Christians is that politics is toxic, and in the United States, we lack a civil discourse in our society. Contempt and public shaming are the main modes of this new illiberalism, the main modes of shutting people up. Andrew Breitbart, who founded Breitbart News, argued a long time ago that politics is downstream from culture. So if you want to understand our politics, you have to look at the culture. But there's something rotten in our culture today. So whereas 20 years ago, this Chinese analyst could say Christianity was at the core, something has shifted dramatically. Historically, Christianity never spread so far and so wide and so deeply influenced Western culture by subordinating itself to politics or culture. In a great piece in the early 20th century, J. Gresham Machen wrote this piece in Christianity and Culture, and he argued that when Christianity is subordinated to the culture around it, Christianity will be destroyed by that culture. So my thesis is that it should be up to us as believers in Jesus Christ to help restore civil discourse in our societies, and we'll do it by maintaining our witness. So the outline of my discussion today, make sure it's on, is I'm going to evaluate the basis of politics. What makes it distinct from the community of faith? And then scripturally, why do we have a necessity to obey political authorities? And then why is there a requirement for prayer for those in political authority? And within that framework then, how might we engage the other being anyone with whom we want to talk about politics? And then finally, I'm going to offer a bit of hope that I think we have historically and recently some reason to be hopeful that we can have a very positive influence on our society and our culture. Now, the basis of politics, and let's just be honest, Glenn Tinder in his book, The Political Meaning of Christianity, argued that the political physics of politics is power. Now, there's a lot to say about this term power, as defined as influence over other human beings. But political power is slightly different. It is based on the coercive power of the state or whatever political entity that exists at the time, because it holds the legal monopoly on the use of force, unless the society is destroyed, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Tinder's right. The political physics of politics is really about power. It's a gravitational pull. Who has power? How do I gain power? How do I engage in power? How do I use it to control others for what I think is important? But it's not just Glenn Tinder that recognizes this. Mao Zedong, the founder of the modern communist China state, argued once that power flows from a barrel of a gun. Niccolo Machiavelli, during the Renaissance period, wrote a book called The Prince, and it was about how leaders must rule, how they must maintain rule. And he said they must be willing to use power, force, and fraud to coerce people to rule well. One of my favorite books in the field that I teach, national security studies, is by an author called Thucydides, who wrote about the 30 Years' War between Athens and Sparta. And this is back in the early 5th century BC. And it's called the Peloponnesian War. And it's fascinating because he shows the rise of Athens as a democracy, but then becomes an imperial power. Sparta is more of a socialist egalitarian state for those who are both socialists and Spartan warriors. But what's intriguing over time is Athens begins to lose its moral compass, and it too relies on power exclusively instead of suasion, moral suasion for the good society it is. And he argues in this one piece, towards the end of their empire, this one section where they go to the island of Milos. It's a little island in the Aegean. And the Melians, the islanders of Milos, are trying to think through, all right, we want to stay neutral. Sparta's pushing us, but Athens is right here with ships, and they're trying to force us. And the Athenian representatives look at the Melians and say, look, it's well known that the strong do what they will, the weak do what they must. And that's the nature of politics, and in particular, international politics. Now, we give government the coercive powers of the state. There's reasons for it, and we'll look at that. But Glenn Tinder makes a good point in his book, The Political Meaning of Christianity, that government is a concession to human sinfulness. In other words, were it not for sin, we might not need this kind of thing. But because we're sinful, because one of the things that we've seen throughout history is humans will hurt one another. In fact, if you haven't noticed it or Hugh hasn't talked about it recently, he did a population study of the early humans and found that they should have achieved over billions of people pre-flood times. And the reason they didn't was a population study will show that 19 out of 20 people were killed by the sin of murder. And so it was rampant evil towards one another and towards everyone that led to this requirement for government. So why do we obey this concession to human sinfulness? Paul talks about it here in Romans 13, the classic piece on obedience to government authority. And he says this, let every person be in subjection to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. He is God's servant. Note this interesting component here. Paul says something very interesting. I italicized every person there because in the Greek it says, let all souls, not just believers, everyone. So the society to function, he's arguing, must have people subordinated to government authority. But we also see here one of the primary fundamental purposes of government is to restrain the expression of evil within a society and from without. And if you look through scriptures, the ancient world, there was three things they required of their government. Protect us from evil from one another, protect us from evil from others outside, and protect us from the evil of the gods. That's not the biblical pattern. It is to protect us from evil from one another, evil from abroad, and to shepherd us to be good stewards of the faith. So this should be the primary end, or telos, the teleology of a state, is good governance, protecting and preserving, expressing the expressions and restraining the expressions of evil from both within and without the society. But there's a balance to this obedience, and there's a reason for this obedience. Why do we need to do it? Why is it necessary? Ultimately, because all authority, government authority, rests on the credibility of the regime's rulers, ability to rule, and a large threshold of humans obeying that political authority. When a whole bunch stop obeying, you get what we see increasingly, particularly in Africa, but elsewhere in the world, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and places like that, increasing anarchy. In political science, we define anarchy as the absence of higher political authority, okay? We talk about international politics as an anarchical society, or an anarchy, because there's no higher political authority than the individual member states, not even the UN. And if you've watched any TV shows, you know peacekeepers have a really rough road to hoe because they have no political authority unless they carry guns. So disobedience, great amounts of disobedience can lead to anarchy in the society, but way too much obedience can increase authoritarianism. And sometimes, to avoid anarchy, certain societies will move towards authoritarianism. Sometimes they do it simply out of self-interest, their regime, their ideology, preserving their political rule. It's interesting when we talk about obedience, Alex de Tocqueville, who was a French foreign diplomat, toured America in the 19th century, about the mid-years before the Civil War. And he argued in his two-part book series called Democracy in America, the thing that he marveled at about Americans was that they were largely law-abiding. They were unlike many other societies. So imagine a line, okay, a line for bread, or a line for food, or a line for whatever. Americans voluntarily lined up and supported one another to get to that, whatever that item was. In many societies, he observed, they didn't. They looked to cheat their way ahead of line. That Americans were this law-abiding groups of people. We can see anarchy, like I said, throughout the world. Somalia, Yemen, as I mentioned, large swaths of Africa. Congo, I don't know if you're aware of, but the largest and longest ongoing conflict in the world today is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's at least 4 million internally displaced people there that are suffering at the regimes and the anarchy that's followed. We also see not just anarchy, but we see authoritarianism on the march throughout the world. We see it with China, with Russia. We see it with a number of other states. We see a certain degree of illiberalism in the United States, do we not? But without a stable form of government that's relatively liberal in the classical sense of that word and open, it becomes immeasurably more difficult to spread the gospel to places like this. So trying to spread the gospel to places like Somalia, where there's warlords and criminal gangs rampant, it's very difficult for us to spread the gospel. It's also very difficult to spread the gospel to very authoritarian regimes that have strong ideologies. And so, in some senses, we want to encourage governments to thrive, but to not become authoritarian. So this is why obedience is necessary. But that leads into this component. Paul says, he urges, that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life. Now, I think it's fascinating here, when you read what he's saying, is that the second foundational rule or purpose of government is that the citizens get to lead a tranquil and quiet life. Paul adds in this passage, in all godliness, but we could say for all human beings, tranquil and quiet life is what is required of government. So protection from evil, and then tranquility in our homes. And C.S. Lewis said, the ultimate test of any political authority is not its ideology, not its spending on social programs, is how well do people live in their homes? How peacefully do they live? So there are more practical reasons too. I think these are good reasons to pray, but I think there's even more practical reasons to pray for those who are in authority. I don't know if you remember the fall 2020 election campaign in the United States, but there was this fellow by the name of Andrew Yang who ran for president. He lost quickly in the primary, and when he got out, he wrote an interesting piece for the online magazine book publishing called Politico. And he wrote a title of a piece that was called, and I love the title, When I Ran for President, It Messed With My Head. And what did he talk about? He said, I went from being a CEO of a small educational tech testing company. And when you're CEO, everything is about making sure the product gets to market, that you take care of your people, that you're focused on the mission. Everything's about that product. But once I ran for office, everything focused on me. I became the product, and it affected my thinking. And there's reasons for this. Now, we know the classic, I think we all know the classic line. We've all heard of it, whether we know who it's attributed to. 19th century British foreign policy genius, Lord Acton once said, "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely." We actually know this now by research psychology. There's a fellow up at the UC Berkeley by the name of Dr. Keltner. He's a research social psychologist. And his book is called The Power Paradox. Absolutely recommend reading it. It's a lot more complicated. I'm simplifying it for you to make it easy to understand. But he argues, and he's shown over 20 years of research, that this is the case. There are those who display these virtues you see on the left that gain power. They have a virtue of being empathetic to each other. They understand what others are thinking, expressing. They listen. They have an attitude of giving. They're willing to give their time, their energy, their talents to this organization. They have an attitude of gratitude. They're grateful for those who help them achieve what they're going to achieve. And they engage in narratives of uniting. They look for ways to make us cohere as a group. And Keltner points out that you can go to any organization and find that typically, not always, but typically, it's people that have these virtues that are given positions of power in a church, in businesses, in a military unit, in government. But what happens is, as soon as they get the perquisites of power, as soon as they are engaged in power, it begins to affect their mind, their way of thinking. Though that virtue of empathy goes towards deficits of empathy. They stop listening and understanding what others are going through. Instead of giving to others, they become self-serving. Instead of being grateful, they engage in greater incivility and disrespect towards others. And instead of narratives that unite the team, they give out narratives that say why we're the exception. One of the reasons for the Me Too movement is this: people in positions of power using it for their own personal gain. But it's not just the Me Too movement. A lot of the movements that we see are about this empathy deficits and things that occur. Now, when we feel defeated in prayer, and I know a lot of believers do feel defeated in prayer, a lot of times, particularly about politics, we must go back to Timothy, and then I would suggest there's some other things that we can learn to pray for. And it's not just for those in politics, but it's for those with whom we're going to engage in politics. One, that our leaders and authorities would be wise in the restraint of evil. Now, that's obviously a very timely topic today because there's this whole debate about defund police, and you name it, or correcting police abuses, whatever it is. I'd suggest the second one is that their policies would help us live peacefully in our own homes. That they would be restrained from the power paradox. Keltner, he's a good secular researcher, does not have, is my judgment, a good way of thinking about this, how to maintain, how to avoid the power paradox. He gives some recommendations, but they seem to fall flat. What other researchers pointed out that study particularly prime ministers and presidents over the last 100 years is the one thing that really preserved a political leader and kept them aware and helped them avoid this power paradox was that they had a very close confidant that they would listen to, that could call them on their junk, and they would listen instead of, shut up, get out here. Kind of like the Saddam Hussein, shoot anyone that disagrees with you. And a fourth thing, especially as we're heading into politics season, and it's always politics season anymore, I'm praying that candidates would be humble yet strong enough to survive the current political environment, that they would have that humility and the support system necessary to help them through. Because I can tell you this political environment is so bad, it's so devastating to people who engage in it, that they either become super hardened or they give up and they suffer mental breakdowns. So those are at least four things. I invite you to think about others that we could pray for. But within all this, then, how do we engage the other? How do we talk to one another about politics? And you know, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to realize that when families split over this, there's something going on that we need to pay attention to. Well, I think the first thing is prayer. Obviously, 1 Timothy 2 gives us this idea. But if you look at engaging another person, think of the way Nehemiah engaged with his political masters in Persia to get to go to Jerusalem. Or you think of the way Daniel did. Pray for those with whom we're going to engage. Pray that God would grant us his grace and favor in the eyes of the other. That really helped Daniel thrive in the political environment of Babylon, which was hostile to Judaism, and in Persia, which was hostile to Judaism, although they allowed the Jews to go home. So prayer is going to be the key. Prayer at all times and in all ways, first and foremost. Second, I think, regard others with respect. 1 Peter 3:15, this is almost, if you had to summarize Hugh's approach to ministry, it's this: always be prepared to give a defense for the hope that's in you, yet with gentleness, respect, and a clear conscience. But respect should be a first priority, and there's at least two reasons. Most of the time we hear one, but I think there's two. The one reason we hear is, look, every human being is created imago Dei, in the image of God. So they have equal standing before God, and we should respect that. But the second thing, and the thing that we need to keep in mind, is that everyone has an eternal destiny. It's not just that they're created in the image of God, but they have an eternal destiny with or without God. And our responsibility is towards that. Respect may also mean, right now, to politely decline to be participating in this illiberal moment in our time. Let's not shame one another or put one another down. But on that idea of eternal destiny, C.S. Lewis, in probably the greatest sermon I've ever read, because I wasn't around, I'm old, not as old as you, but I'm old, but I didn't hear C.S. Lewis do this, but this great sermon he wrote called The Weight of Glory. If you haven't read it, this is absolutely worth listening to and reading and getting a hold of. He says this towards the end of his sermon: it may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would strongly be tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or the other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all of our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. I think the key that I think of, when I first came to see Hugh teach back in 1989, I was a young earther. And he won me over more by his gentleness and respect than by his arguments. And I eventually was won over to his position. May we be that kind of people to those who we disagree with violently on politics. Our behavior will not be the source, if we follow 1 Peter 3:15, our behavior will not be a source of their rejection of the gospel, because we hold a political viewpoint that differs from them. And that remains our overwhelming priority, overriding priority. But then there's a third component to this, and this may be, both the first part of this and the second part of this may be, we may need to require a spiritual discipline for developing this, and that is a gentle approach. My wife is working in marriage family therapy, and she's pointed out from a lot of research that she's read that, when a content of a topic is emotional, at least 80% or more of all meaning comes from the conversation by your demeanor, not by your words. And that's fascinating when you think about it. It's our tone, it's our look, it's our stare, it's our whatever, nonverbal. Contempt is probably the worst, the most dangerous thing that we can engage in with another. John Gottman is a research psychologist at the University of Washington, And he's done studies for years on how do you watch what happens to marriages, and relationships. And he's done these fascinating videos. He'll have couples sit in conversations, and he'll video them with their permission, and you'll see what looks to be a very good, happy couple. But they slow the frame rates down, and they check these little micro statements, visual, facial expressions, and they found little expressions of contempt, little ones, flashes, that fast, is a 94% predictor of divorce in that relationship. Contempt will kill relationships, and contempt is what we're seeing in our society today. So I have just a quick question, and I'm going to flash through these fast. Who would you rather talk to? Just a quick picture up here. A person like this or a person like that? And it doesn't have to be more than a fraction of a second. That contempt that's shown here can be a microsecond of an aggression, and it can actually despoil our relationship. And that's why I say it could be that we need to practice the spiritual discipline. Have your family, have your friends film you and say, here's what you look like when you're expressing contempt. But there's hope, and I'm convinced there is. If we go back to early church history, the early church did not win Rome over by overturning Rome. It won Rome over by being in contrast to how Rome ruled. If you think about it, women and children and slaves were completely devalued in Roman society. And Christian communities valued women, children, and slaves. This is why so many of the Roman aristocracy, women, were the first to engage in the church and took that back to the Roman emperors, to the households of Roman leaders. It's not just the ancient world example. A more recent one is even better in my mind. There's a fellow by the name of Robert Woodbury. He wrote The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy. He wrote it for the absolutely most secular journal in my field you can get, the American Political Science Review. And it was in 2012 he published it, and he established statistically that the historic prevalence where Protestant conversionary missionaries occurred, those societies by huge margins became democratic and liberal and open. In 142 non-European societies. And his study has won awards, and it's been challenged by people, and no one can not only not prove him wrong, they actually concede he's got one of the most interesting dynamic models ever. And it didn't occur with the Catholic Church, it doesn't occur with Islam, it doesn't occur with the Orthodox Church. It was Protestant conversionary missionaries who went to the field to bring Christ there. They did things like advocate for those who were in their charge. They advocated for health. They advocated for, they wanted to teach them how to read so they could read the Bible. They brought the language to them. They also asked for protection of these societies against criminals and thugs. And it was all indirectly. Their focus was on bringing Christ to these people, and the unintended consequence was to make more liberal societies and open. Well, that's the conclusion of my talk. I'm going to allow it for open questions, but I think we have a lot of hope. We have a historical hope. We have a more recent hope in the 19th, 20th century, and it's ongoing today. Do you know that people are fleeing Islam in droves because of the association with Islam and the government? When the government fails, they believe the religion fails. And this is true in the 1040 window across Africa, where Islam is spending billions to establish a mosque within walking distance of every village in entire North Africa. This is true in Iran, where people are converting in droves to Christianity because of the regime is so repressive. So we've got hope. I'm open for questions. Please feel free to do it, and let's put the Q&A on. Mark?
Thank you, Dr. Clark. We're going to alternate between folks in the class and those online. So the first one is Doug.
Thank you for coming, Dr. Clark. Very interesting talk. We were talking before the class a little bit, and I was asking you about knowledge and technology progressing, and you said knowledge is progressing, and I think it's in fulfillment of biblical prophecy even at an alarming rate, an exponential rate even. So I have a follow-up question about that. How much of a threat do you think that is to Christianity and our freedoms that knowledge is increasing so quickly? Are we keeping up with it morally or not? That's my question.
Well, that's a tough question, but I'll try to address it. So one of the
Thank
things, yes. One of the things that I said was, I would say information is increasing exponentially, but I'm not sure knowledge is. Hugh is one of the few people I know, and I try to do it myself. You saw me quoting from psychologists, probably from my wife's influence. But Hugh's one of the few people I know who reads cross-disciplinary. Fuzz Rana does it as well at Reasons. So very few specialists today actually go outside of their field of expertise. Some who specialize just on quantum mechanics specialize in just a tiny slice of that. I don't see it as a threat. Where I see concerns is with the increase of new technologies that have a chance to overwhelm our moral sensibilities. Like nuclear weapons before, artificial intelligence today is a hot topic, right? ChatGPT has come out, and I'll give you an example. I started my seminar this semester, and I said, look, I'm teaching a seminar on the theory and history of strategy, and one of the principal authors I use is a fellow by the name of Karl von Clausewitz, a early 19th century Prussian who wrote about on war. And I said, I've already tried ChatGPT. It doesn't write good essays, so don't try using it. But there's a ChatGPT 4 that's already come out. And I typed in, give me a 1,000-word essay on the main contributions of Clausewitz. And it came out with a very cohesive essay. But it wasn't coherent. Didn't have a single argument. So I'm finding ways to be able to deal with it. But we don't know the answer to that because it's a challenge. And so it's not just artificial intelligence, it's almost all the other fields. Right now, biological engineering and some of the advances that are going in there are going to be a huge challenge. Machine learning is going to be a huge challenge. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question. Am I viewing any students that use ChatGPT? Not as far as I know yet, but I'm testing it. That's why I keep testing it.
We got a question here, Jamalama, who says 19 of 20 people were murdered during the pre-flood. How do they come up with that conclusion? And how do they find data on such a thing?
So that's a good question. That's Hugh's research. But what I would say is go look at the early pre-flood society and look at, particularly is it the father-in-law of Noah, Lamech, who brags to his wives, brags about killing young men and other people, brags about it. And so what's interesting, Hugh did the study. You can get it at Reasons to Believe, I'm sure. You'd have to ask him. I'm not sure exactly how to get it. But he did this population study, a statistical study, and the basic argument was if a married couple lived to 900 years, if the average person lived to 900 years, they didn't start having children until year 50, they had one child every 5 years, there should have been billions years ago, and there weren't. And so we look to those data points in Scripture to see that because the population didn't explode, look to why the flood was done. The thoughts of their heart are evil continually. And we see it with Lamech and others that they are the ones that are engaging in the sin of murder. Yes?
Thanks so much for being here. This is fantastic. Regarding your passage in Romans 13, at what point is it appropriate for Christians to rebel against the authorities, or even do we have to in some circumstances? What's the biblical basis for being able to tell when we should just obey the authorities and when we shouldn't?
Question, Ross, a very good question. So one of the ways to think about it is this. I go to the book of Daniel, and I see in the case of Daniel, in chapter 1, he requests a vegetarian diet. He knows, he didn't protest the imposition of his name, Belteshazzar, right? This foreign god name. He didn't resist that. He didn't resist being captured. He didn't fight for liberation. He likely was castrated and didn't seem to fight that. But he requested a diet of vegetables. Now, why would he have done that? Risking his own life. Because remember, he gives the commander of the guards 10 days, test it. He does it respectfully. So, but what he does by that is that he sets himself, he and his three friends, Abshak, Meshach, and Abednego, set themselves apart from the cultural perquisites of power of Babylon. So that's one example. In the other example, you see his three friends refuse to obey the king's edict to pay attention to his golden statue. Daniel does the same thing in chapter 6. He refuses to stop praying because that was his pattern. 3 times a day to pray east towards Jerusalem based on Solomon's temple dedication prayer in 1 Kings 8. He goes back and does it, even though an edict was forced on Darius, and he resists that. But he doesn't come out and protest, and this is the key thing. I guess the simple answer is those laws that try to compel us into ungodly behavior, we have a moral obligation to refuse. That's not the end of the answer, but that's the beginning of it. So I think there's clear examples where we decline to participate, decline to obey. Then there's trickier ones, like the Protestants that cooperated with the Nazi regime during World War II. That's a little bit trickier. But I think the basic approach is declining to participate with laws that would compel us to disobey God. I think that's the foundation. It's trickier when it comes to masks, mandates, and vaccines. I mean, that's a whole different ballgame. But there's fundamental rules. Yes, there's another question here.
I want to thank you so much. Your talk was incredibly helpful, a framework, and I would personally need more of this just to understand what's going on in our culture today. It's a very concerning, scary time. My question is, could you share some of your experiences working on a university campus and trying to integrate all of this together?
Thank you. So it's quite interesting. It was probably 31 years ago that I taught in Hugh's class, the Daniel series. And I did 6 weeks. I guess he was going off to the mountains somewhere back then. But it was very enlightening to me. It actually becomes the basis for a book I'm doing on politics of Daniel, how Daniel navigated this. So it's fascinating. There's a really interesting period of time when I was co-hosting Hugh's show as well. And anecdotally, I like to tell people the reason why I liked being his co-host was because he was balder than me and he needed more makeup than I did. But I really loved working with him. I learned a lot from him. I also, did this. But I got chewed out on campus for representing the campus as being Christian. And I got really mad for about 10 minutes until I remembered Jesus' words, "Blessed are you when they persecute you for my name's sake." And then I began to think about Daniel, and how did Daniel thrive? Daniel thrived by being the best at what he did, having no corrupting vices, and so I determined then and there to do the best I could. I had to make a pact with God. Honestly, I wanted to leave, but I had to make a pact with God. I will commit to doing the best I can here. Honor me the way you think fit to help me become a better professor. So you have to be willing to endure the consequences of it. But I think Daniel, to me, proved how you can thrive in that academic environment. My program was not liked. It's national security studies at a liberal institution. Come on, what is this? The guy that founded it was a hardcore anti-communist, former submarine commander, outspoken. So all the bad baggage that came with it was that, and then I was a Christian to boot. So it was very tough to navigate those early years. And I was criticized when I was untenured, so I was in the most vulnerable position. I had to rely on how to think about it from Daniel and how to think about it from Christ's perspective. And I honestly, without going into too much detail, I got to tell you, the Lord blessed that environment and blessed me in it in ways that I can't even begin to say without sounding braggadocious, because it's not me, it was him. So thank you for that question. I hope my answer helps a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, question for you here. If you were to update the book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, what would you add or change?
So the question is, if you were to update the book, well, Ken Samples and I have talked about it. There's probably since 2004, there's been a whole new wave of military UAP, now they call it unidentified aerial phenomena, right? And they've even changed that term a little bit because The AARO, it's a new office established in the Pentagon. It's called the, let me see if I can get this, because they change the acronym every couple of weeks. So, All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. That's the new name. And they're trying to do intelligence assessment. What is this phenomena? And they're finding, and now that they've got this office, more reports are coming out. But it's primarily by military pilots, primarily by the Navy pilots, some Air Force, and primarily by only a few. So if I were to update the book, I would think this is where I get a lot of talks I do with the scholar community, with the Reasons to Believe chapters. There's I don't know when Ameris is going to do it, but they're doing a whole documentary on it, and Ken, Hugh, and I think Jeff Zwernick are involved with that process. There's a lot more that could be said, and updating it into the current era. It would be a fascinating discussion. We don't have time. If you want me to talk about it next time, I'd be happy to. But there's a whole bunch of things that we could talk about, what it could be, what it may not be, what it likely is. I don't think anything fundamentally has changed, but we could update some of those things because there seems to be, and Ken has this framework for showing how they were first portrayed in the 50s as being benign, and then they were hostile, and then they were spiritual. Now I think they're against the military. So there's an interesting evolution that's going on that we could update. So, but you have to convince Reasons to Believe to want to publish it because they still apparently have too many books in stock, so they don't want to do it yet.
Norm, do you have a question?
I'd like to return to your kind of thesis of the power paradox, and you've the considerations that you mentioned was that this leader must be strong, and I think the opposite of that, maybe the word is humble, and the strength was required in order to survive, and I guess so. And you kind of mentioned it in a way that you question whether there are people out there today who had those characteristics. And so my two questions is that in recent history, internationally, who are the ones that you could say had those characteristics? And also, today in our country, do you see people on the horizon who you think embody those characteristics?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know about today in the U.S. I honestly do not know. That's why I'm praying hard for them to emerge, to be identified. I don't know enough about certain people to be able to judge with any fairness. You could look at any of the number of candidates that are starting to, bubble up to the surface in the Republican Party. The Democrats haven't done it yet because expected the president will probably re-announce, but even that's unclear. But I would say start in your local districts. Start with school boards. Start with, county supervisors. Pray for those. Pray for those who are running our jails. Pray for those who are running almost everything. So I think that's the start. Probably the best example, historically the best example, I think, is Abraham Lincoln in our history. He had an enormous amount of things to overcome. He wasn't classically trained at all. And I asked one of the best scholars, Harry Jaffa, he wrote a number of books on Lincoln. I said, what made him so brilliant? What made him so able to deal with this? Well, he read two things when he's grown up: King James Bible and Shakespeare. So he understood politics, and he understood these things, and he had good advisors. I suspect, but don't know for certain, that Volodymyr Zelensky is the president of Ukraine, is brave like that and humble. He has corrected course. One of the big challenges for Ukraine has been the level of corruption that existed in a post-Soviet era. And that's been one of the biggest challenges to membership in EU. NATO, forget NATO for now, just membership in the European Union there's a level of corruption in that society that's been ongoing, very much like in the Russian system. He's recently cracked down on that. There's been a lot of firing for people who are corrupt. Now, so from what little I can tell, when he was first asked by the U.S., do you want to ride out? He said, no, we want ammunition. He was willing to stay and fight for his country and lead that country against. So I suspect, but don't know that he may be a very good contemporary example of someone that's humble and has that ability. But it's just my best guess, based on my readings of whatever I read, and there's a lot there, so.
Abraham Lincoln, I'd also throw in Nelson Mandela. Awesome strength. Now, I don't know about his humility, because I think his non-humility actually permitted him to endure all that he endured. But as far as his humility, I'll leave that for somebody else to comment on. I guess the other part of my question is, even in our recent history of this country, we've had leaders. I don't want to get this, I don't want to offer, or I'm not inquiring about a political statement, but we've had a series of presidents. You can go back to Eisenhower, say, for example. And in that sequence, maybe you don't want to comment on that, but I just wonder if in your view, any of our leaders since that time have embodied these principles.
So you are going to force my hand, whether you want to or not, but I'm going to turn it on you. Sorry about that. And here's the reason why. What I have discovered in dealing with international politics, national security, and contemporary politics is the best way to get people to think about current leaders without the charge, the high-intensity combat that we exist in, environment, is to go back and read older leaders. This is why it probably takes 20 or 30 years before a president can even be fairly evaluated by historians and analysts. It takes that length of time, that historical distance, to have a perspective. So what I do for my students is I have them read ancient debates. That's why I read Thucydides and Clausewitz. We look at other leaders to bring them up so that they're not captured by the current trends, because you have to have a deeper layer of thinking about, wait a minute, this is a recurring pattern. This is not new. Good leaders, there was the hubris piece that I cited earlier, the scholars that looked at and evaluated prime ministers and presidents of the last 100 years. What I thought was interesting is that even they had a hard time with their political bias, because as soon as it got to contemporary presidents, it became clear which party they belonged to and which one they didn't. And so it's very difficult to look at contemporary without being biased. The only reason I comment on Zelensky is that I know he's controversial with some people, but it seems to me that he's got some of that capability, but we're removed by both an ocean and literally 2 continents. So that's why I feel a little bit freer. But it's very difficult to judge in a public space like that. Yes. So thank you for your question. I hope my question was my answer was responsive. Okay.
Okay. Just a comment from Esther. Mark Clark was the host of the RTV television show when I first discovered RTV. A few years ago. All right. Michael's up next. Come on, Michael.
I see a revival in the church, the big church, and because of the internet. And you brought up the subject about old earth, new earth, and I was a Jehovah's Witness for 20 years, and I found things that they believed that I said, well, this is not true. So how important is, because we have the internet and we find out, well, there's different traditions, Christian traditions, and I started studying things like Richard Rohr and mysticism, and I'm finding, well, a lot of these things are beneficial. So I think this adds to the church. And, a lot of people will disagree with me. They say, well, no, there's certain things that are true and there's certain things that are not true. So how do we know, is truth really important?
That's a very big question. It's one that the church has dealt with since its early years, right? I mean, I was talking about this with some friends. Yeah, the conversations at our house are kind of interesting. But with some friends who were over, and there was the whole process of canonization, that is, acknowledging which which books were canonical, which means suitable for rule, and inspired. That was Jewish. The Jews had that same issue. They had to go over a period of centuries. So part of it's debate, discussion. Why are there books called the Apocrypha that we do not recognize that the Catholic Church does? And in the Protestant tradition, it's because it was seen that those books conform more to human traditions than the rest of Scripture. And so some of these issues have been resolved. Some are still ongoing, as you mentioned. But there's elements, I wouldn't say mystical, but there's elements of sort of mystical, church history, right? There's St. John of the Cross talks about the dark night of the soul, and there's this idea that you draw close to God through these really sort of rough periods of time that you go through in your life where you feel completely isolated from Him. And there's some Christians that just, that's wrong, you can't. It's very useful in spiritual formation classes and things like that. So, I think, so the key for us has always been, we call the Scriptures canon, and that means they're the rule, the measuring stick by which we live our lives. And if something contradicts it, we have to say that's unacceptable, and here's why. But you have to engage still with respect and gentleness and try to bring them back. I mean, the reason why we accept what's called the hypostatic union of Jesus Christ, the union of two, divine and human nature, is because of a controversy by a guy named Arius who said that no, he couldn't be divine. And we had to really wrestle with that and just say, well, no, Arius is wrong. And he insisted, without any willingness to agree, that he was in error. So there will be those with whom we disagree, and we can say we're not a part of that. But yeah, so that's my short answer to a very, very tough question, one that's been ongoing throughout history. There comes Mark running up to the microphone.
Sorry. Ted, come on up, Ted.
Hi. So I arrived late. I'm not sure if you addressed this at all, but following up on Ross's question on how we should engage the culture now with our values and beliefs. I'd like to ask you your assessment of Dr. Martin Luther King and his strategy for, what was it called? Resistance, nonviolent, but civil disobedience, right, that. I'd like to get your assessment about that. It's a very recent example, and of course it's in deep contrast to what we're seeing around us today. But what's your assessment of his strategy? It would seem to me that it's very close to the example of Daniel that you gave.
That's an excellent one. Martin Luther King, it's still disobedience. So let's just, state it. It is disobedience. If we're willing to be disobedient, we must be willing to pay the consequences. Paul said that. If I've done something wrong, let me be executed. Daniel is willing to accept the decline of his request to be on a vegetarian diet. He was willing to accept being cast into the lion's den. Abshak, Meshach, and Abednego said, hey, our God can deliver us from the fire, but we're willing to do that, to resist it. So we have to keep in mind, even though it's civil, it's a politer form of disobedience, it was nonetheless disobedience. Now, was he entirely wrong? No. It was unjust how the rules against blacks were enforced. Segregation and all the other things that were associated with it. And as believers in Christ, we should be supporting that all people are created equal. That comes from our declaration. And Martin Luther King, was brilliant about citing our original documents to go back to that idea that we're not living up to the ideas of the American establishment. But I would say it's still disobedience. And civil, yes. Peaceful, yes. But it is disobedience, and every believer should be willing to pay the consequences. What I am concerned about is some Christians who think they're being persecuted because they're being disobedient. And it's like, well, no, what do you expect the state to do? The state, whether it's just or unjust, God is your judge. God is my judge, not the state. So we should be willing to accept that punishment. Just like, and I'll give you an example from my field. General Singlaub was the commanding general of the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea. And President Jimmy Carter at that time said, we ought to withdraw the 2nd Infantry Division. And he resigned in protest because he thought it was bad policy. And I remember meeting General Singlaub, and he said this. He goes, if I'm willing to die for my troops in war, I should be willing to give up my career for them in peacetime. Well, I think we too, as believers, if we're willing to, believe God, then we should be willing to pay the price for that. And that becomes a witness. Paul used his time in prison as a witness for Christ, even though he had the right to that authority to appeal to Roman citizenship, which he did after he served and God broke through. So that's my simple answer. Martin Luther King is a great example, but it is disobedience. He did have changes, and he effected changes. So there's a cost to that, and we should be willing to pay for those costs. Short answer to a good question. Thank you.
Okay, next up, Tim.
How do you think unrestricted access to the internet has affected the psyche and spirituality of young people in this country?
So that's a great question. So is it internet, or is it social media in particular, or is it everything? Everything. Okay. So there's a number of ways I could take this, but unrestricted internet access, I think, I'm going back to Plato. He complained once we started writing things down because he thought it was getting away from telling good stories. So I'm going to sound like a curmudgeon like Plato did. Having internet access is great, but if you haven't learned to think, just being able to pick up a phone and look and see what the answer to that question is, does that mean you've improved your knowledge, your learning, your thinking? So I think it can become a useful tool, but it has become, in particular with social media, a destructive tool. There's benefits to having social media. I didn't join it because for a long time, until my colleague who died was on social media, and he died, and I wanted to reconnect with all the alums that he connected with. So there were good reasons for me to start it. But we're seeing the massive effect on particularly younger girls, young people, but in particular young girls, affecting their depression, their body image, self-image, their engagement with others. They're lonelier, they're more anxious, they're more obnoxious, not just it's because they're girls. It's the generation that produces this, and TikTok is driving it even further. So like all technology, it can be used for good and for ill. I had this question when I was an undergrad. Guns, they're evil, right? I said, no, it's just like a tool. It's like aspirin. Of course, you can poison yourself with too much aspirin, and I can kill someone out of murder, but I can also defend my home and relieve my pain. And I think the same thing with social media and all this. I think the biggest challenge today is the overwhelming nature of it, and we have not come to terms with, and let's be honest, parents are at fault here. Parents are not creating a culture of responsible use. They need to be stricter about access. I have really good friends that have, very strict controls. Kids don't like it, but, they learn to deal with it until they mature to certain levels, and they can handle the emotional impact. Particularly, like I said, studies are showing the disproportionate effect on young teenage girls of episodes of loneliness, despair. The whole incel movement, involuntary celibate movement by men, is in part because of all this. So there's all kinds of bad effects, but there's good things to be had. But what I really am frustrated with is the algorithmic controls that the social media puts in to force people to keep, or encourage you to keep looking and give you that dopamine hit when you do, and you do, and you do. So, but that's why I think we ought to train our folks to how to use it well and not get addicted to that, but get addicted to knowledge and things. And there's a good argument right there for classical Christian education. Teaches you how to think, teaches you how to engage the original books and not look up quick answers. But that's a different topic for another day. Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't have any more questions online. Anyone in the class still have a question? Well, this has been fantastic, Dr. Clark, and we really want to thank you and want to welcome you back again in a month. So could you close us in a short prayer? We'd appreciate it very much.
Sure. Father in heaven, it's with the awe and circumspection that's due this topic that I ask for your guidance, your grace and favor granted to us to think these things through responsibly, with respect, and with you in mind, first and foremost. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added. And I think that's true here as anywhere else. Father, I thank you for our Lord Jesus Christ, for his work on the cross as we enter this season of Advent, Easter season, and we're thinking about what your son has done for us. May we really grapple with thinking about how to engage in our culture with you in mind first, like the prophets of old, like Daniel, like Nehemiah, and like others. And like, in fact, your son did while here on earth. And we thank you for these things. We thank you for this class. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys.